Good morning, everyone. We have a small but mighty group here this morning. Welcome, all of you. I hope you enjoyed that video. And let me just tell each and every one of you who did participate in the Concert for the Children, it was awesome, and UCSF is so grateful for all of your support and volunteer spirit. But you're here this morning, despite what I suspect might have been some late nights last night, because we've got a great session this morning, something really inspiring. What can you do about your health? Not just what you can do about your health, but how to think about your family's health, your future, and the future of your kids. We have an incredible lineup, but not a monolithic lineup. You're going to hear three, I think, very different points of view about how you can approach taking control for yourself of your health and your future. And I don't know about you, but I can't wait to hear the speakers. After the speakers, we're going to have a little bit of a panel discussion. And for those of you who follow Mark Benioff on Twitter, who follows Mark Benioff on Twitter? If you don't, you should. He already threw down a little bit of a smackdown. East versus West. So as you listen to these speakers, I'll push you to think about, is this really East versus West? What resonates for me? How do I think about this information about my health and wellness and take advantage of it? But let's get to the speakers. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who's not just an incredible thought leader in health, but a personal friend of mine for the last 20 years. David Agus is one of the world's leading cancer doctors and pioneering biomedical researchers. Today, he's professor of medicine and engineering at the University of Southern California Keck School of Medicine and Viterbi School of Engineering. Dr. Agus leads USC's Westside Cancer Center and the Center for Applied Molecular Medicine. How did I meet him? I met him at a birthday party. And since the day I met him, he's been pushing me and colleagues to go faster and do better things for patients with cancer. Over the past 20 years, he's received acclaim for his innovations in medicine and contributions to new technologies that continue to change all of our perceptions of health. You may know him from his best-selling book, The End of Illness. The End of Illness. Or you may have seen him on CBS, where he's a regular contributor. So now get ready for his next book that will be coming out in January 2014, A Short Guide to a Long Life. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Agus. Welcome.
Thank you so much. So about 2 years ago, I wrote a book, and I sent it to the publisher, and I finished it. I was all excited, and 2 weeks later, I had a call back from the publisher saying, Steve Jobs called and changed the title of your book. I said, what? And I had called the book, What is Health, with a question mark. Because to me, that was the key question. I didn't know what health was. Was it how long you live? Was it how you look? Was it how you feel? Was it your cholesterol level? How do you optimize on a system when you don't have a parameter upon which to optimize? So I call up Steve, and I go, Steve, what are you doing? Why would you change the title of the book? And his answer was simple. He said, if you put the word health in the title, it turns people off in our country. The word health is like chewing cardboard, he said. You need to have a positive declaratory title. He said, if you can't give a gift of a book with the word health in it, because you imply the other person is in bad health. And the following year, it was one of the most gifted books on Amazon. So it tells you Steve knows marketing. Then I said, well, why would you call the publisher and not me? And he said, it's their job to market the book, not yours. I said, all right, I'll take marketing advice from you. And so after I wrote it, I sent it to a bunch of friends and colleagues, and a columnist for the New York Times called me up and said, David, I like your book, but why do you have the right to write this book? And I thought about it for a while, and this is what came into my mind. The notion that if you wish for peace, understand war. In cancer, for good or for bad, we go to the edge of the cliff, and we push people, and we give them therapies, and that hopefully we pull them back and try to bring them toward health. And from being in that complex system where you have to push, you learn a lot. And so what I'm going to tell you today is what I learned on that edge of the cliff, and to bring it back to where I think we actually need to make a big impact on health. Obviously, health has been in the headlines. Health has been talked about in Washington for the last decade. And remember, in Washington, they have X bandwidth for health. And for that last decade, it's all been about healthcare finance. I really believe we need to change the discourse, and we need to actually start to talk about health. Because without health, there are going to be some major problems in this country. When healthcare is 18.5% of GDP and rising, when food and health are 31% of the US economy, yet we're not talking. And so this was the original title of the book. And again, it's very hard for me to walk up to a 20-year-old and say, listen, I want you to do things for your health. The answer back is a blank stare. And the reason is, how do you do something that's going to change you a decade, 2, 3, 4 from now without something to follow? Most people won't do it. And so we need to change that. And so Mark Twain once said that the only way you keep your health is eat what you don't want, drink what you don't like, and do what you'd rather not. Well, I will tell you that's not the case in health. And I'll show you some clear examples in that regard. So what's the metric? You know, and 2 years ago, we spent close to $1.5 billion on growth hormone in this country. If I took a 70-year-old and give them a shot of growth hormone, they're going to look better, they're going to feel better, their neighbors are going to come up to them and say, you look like $1 million bucks, what happened to you? Well, the sad truth is that they're probably going to live shorter. And the same is true with things like testosterone. An amazing study came out last week, one of the first big data studies, where they took all the Veterans Administration data from the VA hospitals across the country. And they said people on testosterone versus not for low T, we call low testosterone. And what it did was increase the rate of heart attack and death by 30%. And by the way, death is a bad side effect. There was an amazing study about 2 years ago in a journal called Science Translational Medicine, where they looked at people from a small town in Ecuador. And these people had a mutation in growth hormone, so they're actually short stature. And in this population of about 26,000 people, there was almost no diabetes and cancer. Yet in our country, we strive for the opposite. And so the key is, what is your value system? Do you want to be good today and look good? Or do you want to play with your grandkids tomorrow? And so it really is a critical value system-based decision. And I'm going to show you again some data that hopefully can shift your mind a little bit on this regard. But obviously, our goal is to live until our 9th or 10th decade. Our goal is to play with our grandchildren. And in order to get there, we have to do something very simple. We have to prevent disease. Because preventing disease is the best way to actually live longer. We are not good, and the sad truth is, we are not good at treating disease. We are not good at treating cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, but we are good at prevention. And I'm going to show you some very simple things we can do in that regard. Because I want people to actually live longer. And the amazing fact is that it will actually lower healthcare costs. 83 is the magic age in our country, where if you live to it and you get sick, we don't put you on a ventilator, we don't put you in an intensive care unit, we don't do these crazy heroic things that cost the individual and society yet have little to any benefit. We actually let people do that in 1953 was the last year you were allowed to do in the United States. 1953 was the last year you were allowed to die with the cause of death on your death certificate being old age. I want to go back to dying of old age. I want to go back to having people live until the day they die. And so I argue that we got screwed in our field. We made a mistake because of one experiment in the 1920s. And this experiment changed medicine for the next 90 years. There were 12 people. They each had a large cut on their leg. Half of them, they dipped a piece of bread in water and wrapped it on their leg, and half they left open to the air. Well, the people who had the moist bread on their leg healed twice as fast. And that experiment changed medicine, right? The bread developed mold. The mold made penicillin. and it spawned something called germ theory. Germ theory said, if you look in the microscope and identify what you're up against, you know how to treat it. Well, it turns out that's true for infectious disease, but that's not true for cancer, Alzheimer's, and heart disease. They are what we call complex systems. So if you look down at the one cell, it doesn't tell you what's going on in the rest of the body, right? Infectious disease is from without. The other diseases are from within. They're your body intersecting with itself. If you are going to drive from San Francisco to Los Angeles and you take a car, you take off every piece and look at it, it's not going to tell you how long it takes to make that trip. You forgot about the weather, the traffic, how much caffeine the driver drank, the bladder size of the driver. You can't just look at the car. And unfortunately, what we've done since this experiment is keep looking at the car. We need to change. And so we are what we call a complex emergent system. The reason we need to change is this slide. The reason we need to change is this is data from 1950 to 2007. The last year we had data from the Center for Disease Control at the time. And it looked at the rate of death from diseases. Dramatic decrease in heart disease and stroke. Why? We're smoking less. And by the way, still today, 19% of kids in high school smoke tobacco, even though we are dramatically smoking less. And the second reason is we have a class of drugs called statins that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But if you look on the right there, cancer, almost no impact. And again, I argue it's because we're treating it like germ theory. It's because we're looking at that car in depth and we forgot to look at the roads and the traffic. So what is a complex emergent system? Well, it's simple. You've got your inputs, and that's what you eat, that's your genetics, that's where you live, that's who you live with, and you have your output, which is how you feel. And that middle state function, which has been hidden throughout history, we can now, through technology, I'll show you in a few minutes, we can see for the first time. And so the sad truth is that a complex emergent system is almost impossible to understand. And I guarantee you we cannot understand the complex emergent system that's you and I. Why do I say that? Well, a year ago, we didn't understand the microbiome, the bacteria in our body. And we just did this year, as I'll show you in a few minutes. 6 months ago, we thought junk DNA was junk. And we're learning that it controls other DNA. Every 6 months or so, we're learning a new dimension to us. And so if there's still many more dimensions to be learned, how can we actually understand it? If I ask my son, how do you stop a train? He doesn't say, well, what's the track made of? What's the train weight? What's the weather? He just says you pull the brake. Well, a complex emergent system, you don't have to understand to control. That climate modeler goes out and looks at the shape of the clouds. They don't go up there and measure the wind speed at 20,000 feet, the temperature up there. They look at the shape of the clouds. And from it, they can actually make an educated decision. I want doctors to be more like climate modelers than biologists going forward, as I'll show you. And so an amazing experiment was done in the early 2000s. And they took women who were premenopausal with breast cancer. And they divided them after their treatment, and half of them received a drug that builds bone, a drug for osteoporosis of all things, and half of them received placebo. And in that experiment, they reduced recurrence of the breast cancer by 40%. Turns out one of the largest survival advantages of any clinical trial in the field from a drug that didn't even touch the cancer. Why? Because breast cancer metastasizes to bone. So you change the soil, the seed doesn't grow. I'm going to tell you a story now that may offend some of you, and I apologize in advance. It will offend you because of the cast of characters, but I still think it's an important experiment to talk about. So in the 1997, I was a trainee at Sloan Kettering Cancer Center in New York, and a 25-year-old kid walked through the door. This kid had germ cell tumor in the brain, the lung, and the liver, and the doctors there told him, you know, listen, chemotherapy is going to make you sick. I want you to spend your last time and your quality time with your family. You're the son of a single mother. Go back to Texas and spend your last months with her. Instead, he went to Indianapolis. And he went there because a doctor did a kind of goofy experiment. He took 2 platinum electrodes and he put them in a gel. And this is platinum, the same thing in my wedding band here. And he said, do cancer cells like electricity or not? Well, the cancer cells didn't care about the electricity, but some of the platinum leached off some of these electrodes and killed some of the cells, so they gave it intravenously. Well, a year and a half later, he won his first of 7 now contested Tours de France. And so obviously the character is Lance Armstrong. And for all the issues and the conflict that's happened with him over the last several years, the power is, when you look at his case, something dramatic happened. We were on stage at a TED Talk, and Lance looked me in the eye and said, David, 15 years ago I was given a death sentence. Today I'm alive. How did platinum work? And I looked him back in the eye and I said, I have no freaking idea. Platinum changed Lance so the cancer didn't want to grow. And I think it's a very powerful statement of this notion of this system that we are. Everything we do changes the system one way or another. And I'm going to show you a little bit what that means. But first, take what I say with a grain of salt. I am the same profession that did this. I am the same profession that said this, and this, and this. I love this. Lady with a lamp. I am the same profession that said 24 years ago, I want you to take margarine and not butter. And if you look at the epidemiologic data, we killed millions of people by doing so. So we are so good at these declaratory statements. We are so good at making a big statement with no data behind it. So I want to look now at a couple of things we all do in our day and start to say, where is the data? And let's actually start to analyze some of them and see what comes out. So the first is exercise. If I say to most people, what is the exercise you do? They say, I go to the gym for an hour, I put in a DVD, I do my calisthenics, my yoga, my Pilates, I go jogging for an hour, and then I go to work. Well, the sad truth is that sitting for 5 hours a day is equivalent on a health basis of smoking a pack and a quarter of cigarettes. Sitting for 5 hours is equivalent on a health basis to smoking a pack and a quarter of cigarettes. So no matter what you did in that morning, and I love that you went to the gym, you then go and sit the rest of the day, we've got a problem there. So where did this data came from? It really was an amazing data set. In 1953, in the medical journal Lancet, a remarkable paper came out. And what they did was they looked at the British Transit Authority. There were no privacy laws then. They could just open the medical records of whoever they wanted. There were 26,000 workers in the British Transit Authority. Half were the bus drivers that sat and drove the bus all day, and half were the ticket takers that walked up and down those double-decker buses. They weighed the same, smoked the same, lived in the same environment, and married people of similar socioeconomic background. Yet dramatically less heart disease and cancer in the ticket takers. We have become a society of bus drivers. The more important you are in the company, the closer your parking space is to your desk. The richer you are, the more bathrooms in the house, so you don't even have to walk room to room to go to the bathroom. We design houses now based on LEED certification, how they affect the environment, and the same thing with buildings. Why aren't we doing it with health? If I'm the CEO of a company, the first thing I do is I make the elevators coin-operated. I want to show the employees that taking an elevator not only harms one's own health, but takes from the bottom line of a company. Remember, one heart attack costs a company $78,000 that's self-insured. One case of colon cancer is $127,000 to the bottom line of a company. So if you're a company, you want to push for prevention. You want to make people move. So I was shocked. I put on a device like this, and I looked at what I did during the day. And I was shocked how much I sat. I was shocked how sedentary I was, and I didn't even know it. So now I've got a treadmill desk. Actually, Mark Benioff pushed me to get it. It takes about 2 weeks to get used to it. You kind of fall a little bit in the beginning. But then, when I do emails now for 2 hours a day, I'm actually walking. I got one of those headsets where I walk around the office and kind of look like an air traffic controller, but I'm walking on those conference calls. And now, at the end of the day, I looked at how much I moved over time. If I'm below my wife at the end of the day, I can walk the dog so I can go to bed #1. So it turns out game theory works. Competition is a good thing. If you look across the board with the Nike Fuel Band, the more people somebody competes against, the more they do during the day. It's an amazing concept that movement equals health. It's an amazing concept that you and I were designed to move. Our lymphatics in our body that control our immune system have no muscles in their wall. It's actually the rhythmic contraction of the muscles in your legs when you walk that make our body homeostatic, that make our body work. You know, that same paper in the journal Lancet in the 1950s had an amazing figure. They looked at profession and cause of death. The best were the gardeners and the coal miners because they're walking on the time. The worst were the typists because they were sitting, and the hairdressers because they were standing in one spot. The best were the coal miners. Pretty wild data if you think about it. There's actually beautiful data, and this is data that was published showing the more you move, the longer you live. And yet we don't do it. There's data from the state of California that if you take school periods where kids are being educated during the day and replace them with 20 minutes of exercise 3 times a week, children learn more. Aptitude scores go up. And so if a parent has a child, before they go to school, the first thing they should say is, how many units did you get today, this morning? Did you move enough? If a child exercises for 15 minutes, he or she will retain 17% more knowledge for 5 hours. So if you want your child to achieve their potential, you're going to make them move. It has tremendous importance. I'm going to switch gears now and talk about technology. 1974, the Monsanto annual report estimated that it will cost $150 million to sequence 1 gene. When I launched the book, we did 4 nightlines in a row. The first nightline, Bill Weir, the nightline anchor, 41, healthy, skinny guy, 2 young kids, travels all over the world, came into my office. Live on TV, we sequenced his DNA. We showed that he was higher risk for heart disease, even though he was only 41. And so what we did was live on TV, we put him in a heart scanner. And he called it the story that saved his life. Why? Because we found 2 blockages in his arteries in his heart. One in the major artery supplying his heart. The next morning, the American Heart Association issued a statement saying, David didn't do the right thing. Bill Weir wasn't eligible for cardiac screening. And I said, what? Your criteria are wrong because he was positive. And so instead of saying we shouldn't be screening people, we should be lobbying for better technology, more cheap technology, technology that doesn't involve x-rays, which are radiation, which unfortunately is required to do that scan. And by the way, a heart scan without health insurance costs $79. And so we need to push to identify, because he changed his behavior. He went on preventive therapy that we'll talk about in a minute. Identifying what you're up against counts. So this is my DNA. So we founded a company years ago called Navigenics, where the notion is you can look at your DNA and actually know some of the diseases and their likelihood of happening in your lifetime. It's not deterministic. It doesn't say what will happen. It says your relative risk. And it tells you as an individual where to focus. And it's powerful. It was a religious moment for me somewhat, all of a sudden seeing on a piece of paper myself. And I actually did change behaviors because I had a higher risk for heart disease. So we changed our diet, we being my family and I. We meet once a week, we go to the farmer's market together, and we actually choose and talk about what the food means for each of us. But you can't blame your parents for everything. It's about half is genetic and half is the environment. You control your environment. You control what you eat, where you live, the stress level, who you live with, etc. You control whether you take a medicine to prevent disease. You control much of that. And so the notion is you need to know where to optimize and where to push. information matters. People say, well, family history is a good thing. Family history is a very good thing. The problem is that many people's grandparents, my own, they didn't talk about disease. If they had cancer or heart disease, that was a bad word. They kept it in the closet. Instead, we need to bring these things in the open. And whether it be a genetic test or asking your parents, grandparents, and great-parents what happened, it's important. About 4 months ago, the New York Times called and said, Angelina Jolie just announced that she had the faulty gene for breast cancer. Will you write something? So I thought about it for a while, and I wrote about that in the late 1990s, our government, our taxpayer dollars, put $25 million to a program to identify the faulty gene for breast cancer. It was actually done in the Mormons. You know, all of the Mormons wanted to be buried in the church. They couldn't fit. And so they actually had hair and health histories. And from that, they identified this gene. It was licensed to a company. That company went bankrupt and was licensed to a second company. And that company charged about $5,000 for the test. Well, I could run that test on any of you for less than $100, yet the company charged $5,000. When asked, the company said, well, listen, insurance pays for most high-risk people. Well, why do you think insurance costs are out of control? And so I called it predatory practice. I called it monopolistic pricing. Then about 3 weeks later, there was actually a Supreme Court decision that democratized DNA. A Supreme Court decision that said, you can no longer patent a human gene in our country. It allowed all of us the ability to look at our own DNA without being sued. It allowed all of us, no matter our income, to actually start to look and say, are we at risk for these diseases, and do we need to take action? And the price is coming down dramatically. It is falling in half every few months. And so all of a sudden, the playing field is being equalized. All of a sudden, we now can start to look at things because of something positive the government did on health. And that doesn't happen too often over the last couple of years. And so in an era where we talk about the Affordable Care Act, in an era where all of us are talking about access to health care, which I believe in, at the same time, we need to start talking about health. And so let's switch gears. I wrote a piece in December in the New York Times that was one of the most downloaded articles of the year, and we called it the 2,000-year-old wonder drug. It was about a pill a day that if you take it, reduces not the incidence, but the death rate of cancer by 37%, heart disease by 22%, and stroke by 17%. It was about a pill that was initially described by Hippocrates 2,400 years ago when he said, you take the bark of the willow tree and chew it, and pain and fever go away. This pill costs $3 a year. This pill, if we all took it, would have a dramatic effect on how long we lived as a country. Yet most of us don't. It's called a baby aspirin. And so the notion that a baby aspirin a day can have a dramatic effect on these diseases is very powerful and profound. Yet, why don't most people do it? We have a notion in our country that you can do whatever you want with regard to health. You can be obese, you could drink soda all day, eat trans fats, sit all day, smoke cigarettes, and then society will pay for the ramifications on a healthcare basis of what you did. Do what you want, and then we will pay. Well, that has to change. One of the most amazing things was I was interviewed in Washington, and they were saying, what do you like about the federal government? I said, I love the fact that they really push for fundamental biomedical research. They fund me and many other scientists across the country. And said, what don't you like? I said, listen, of the $30+ billion budget of the NIH, when I asked how much of it was spent on optimizing aspirin, taking away the side effects, making it better, the answer was zero. It's unintellectual. We need to change that. We need to take an observation like this and start to say, how do we get more people to do it? And how, at the same time, do we make it better? Because there clearly are side effects. Yet at the same time, it's a profound thing that a pill a day that reduces inflammation will have a dramatic effect on both heart disease and cancer. There's another class of drugs that have been in the news and the front pages of the last 2 weeks called statins. This was a class of drugs that was developed to lower cholesterol. But it turns out that their dominant mechanism is something else. It blocks inflammation. This is a pill, again, that is someone with a high cholesterol or a low cholesterol can actually delay heart disease and reduce the incidence of many cancers. This is a pill that if one is diagnosed with cancer and is on this pill, one actually lives longer. This is a pill that does have some side effects. They are minimal and they are reversible. So the argument is, talk to your doctor and say, why shouldn't I be on an aspirin or a statin? And the answer may be, listen, your risk is so low it doesn't make sense. Or the answer might be, listen, you've got a moderate risk, why don't we try it? If you have no side effects, it makes sense. If you do have side effects, it doesn't. So the naysayers say, well, listen, this is just pushing the pharmaceutical industry. Well, for a 90-day supply of these statins, the Lipitor-like drug, without health insurance, costs $9 at Walmart. And so most of these, if not all, are generic. And they don't actually help the pharmaceutical companies, they help us. And so we need to ask the questions again with all of us. How do we focus on prevention? How do we get people to realize that what we do today matters tomorrow? How many of you had your flu shot this year? Half of you. So if you skipped the flu shot and you got the flu, you would probably get better, right? You'd be sick for 4 or 5 days. Hope you don't kiss anybody. Hope you don't go to work and spread it. But at the same time, your rate of heart disease and cancer would be 10 and 12% elevated a decade from now. 10 and 12% elevated. The inflammation associated with the flu has ramifications down the road. So I want people to think not just about today, but also about tomorrow. And so the big question will come is, why are these things optional? Why do we have the ability to say, I don't want to do it? It's going to, in the end, charge ourselves, our family, our society, and our government. And so if we want to make a difference, there needs to be a call to arms. There needs to be a movement that's saying, listen, healthcare costs in our country are out of control. They're 18.5% and going upwards. In order to make them downwards, we have to focus on prevention. Focus on doing things that we know work. At some point, we all have a right to do what we want, but we have to say, what is the right thing to do? At some point, scientific data hit a certain critical point where it needs to become normative behavior, where we need to say, listen, the data are there, we need to take action. The problem is leadership. If I ask you who's the greatest healthcare leader over the last decade, very few names come to mind. In fact, the biggest one is probably the mayor of New York City. So the fact that the mayor of New York City is one of the greatest health leaders is a sad statement. We don't have leadership. And when anything you see today being on the internet and a newspaper tells you one thing one day, the next thing the next day, it confuses all of us. And so in order to get an understanding, we actually will need leadership going forward. So let's shift gears and talk about something else, vitamins. We spend $2.5 more dollars in our country on vitamins than in all of medical research. By the way, we spend more on potato chips than on cancer research in our country. So 39,000 women tracked for close to 2 decades, and they looked at women who took vitamins and women who didn't. The women who took vitamins were actually healthier at the start, yet they had a 15% higher death rate. So it's a pause for alarm. You look and you say, that's kind of interesting. Well, let's look at the breakout here. And so this is a study, or these are studies that I pulled from headlines over the last 6 months. Because according to these headlines, vitamin D can do everything. Vitamin D will prevent heart disease, cancer, will cure most diseases. But let's actually look at the data. And so 75% of us in the United States are what we call vitamin deficient. 97% of African Americans. So first of all, who defined what normal is? There's a paper that's coming out, I think today, in the New England Journal of Medicine that starts to address this, which says that our current ways of looking for vitamin D are wrong. Remember, you have vitamin D, you've got the sensor, which is a receptor, and then you've got a bunch of signaling molecules. And so when you measure one node of a network, what does it actually mean? And the answer is very little. Remember, you and I have evolved a very complex mechanism to block having too much vitamin D at once. It's called tanning. The reason we tan is to block vitamin D absorption. Yet, many of us actually take vitamin D or take calcium and vitamin D. Why? Somebody has told us, listen, you're getting older, your hormones are going down, so you're more risk for bone fracture, so take these. Take these pills. Well, let's actually look at the data. Remember, the country of Canada had to outlaw vitamin D testing because it was 11% of their entire country's laboratory budget several years ago. So if you take 2,200 women over the age of 70 and randomize them to receive vitamin D that raises their level for a year versus placebo, you have a 26% increase in the rate of bone fracture. Not decrease, increase. In the Women's Health Study, they looked at 25,000 women randomized to calcium and vitamin D or placebo, and there was no effect on bone fracture rate at all of taking calcium and vitamin D. So why do people take this pill that has real side effects, kidney stones, stomach upset, etc., when nobody has actually shown a benefit? I really asked that question, and I don't know the answer. There was a great article in the Atlantic Monthly 2 months ago that started to say why vitamins happened. And they attribute much of it to Linus Pauling, the Nobel laureate. Somebody of that stature who said vitamins can help. All of a sudden, there was a takeoff in the industry. We do it over and over again. We take these pills. And again, it questions why. The government, our government, spent close to $250 million, $247 million, to do a study where they took the 34,000 plus men and they randomized them to vitamin E or placebo to prevent prostate cancer. Why? Because many men, significant numbers, were taking vitamin E to prevent this cancer. They had to halt the study 3 years in because there was a 17% increase in prostate cancer in the men who took these pills. So again, why do we as a society say, do whatever you want, take these pills, when you're 65, which is when you'll get prostate cancer, we will pay for your care. There is something wrong here. There's something fundamentally in this picture that doesn't make sense. 63 randomized studies in the history of mankind with more than 1,000 people, multivitamins versus placebo, none have ever shown a benefit, ever. So the naysayers said, well, Agus, disease is so random and it happens so rarely every year in an individual. Let's look at people with higher disease. So smoker and former smokers, 18,000 of them randomized to beta-carotene and vitamin A. What do you know? 28% higher lung cancer incidence, 17% higher death rate, and again, bad side effect when you took these supplements. Yet we allow people to do it. We don't just allow, most people over the age of 50 in this country take them. There's a notion that vitamins are good, anything by the pharmaceutical company is bad. By the way, who do you think makes most of the vitamins? It's the pharmaceutical companies. So there's another study that came out about 3 or 4 weeks ago looking at the 70 most common supplements taken in the United States. About a third of them were just dust. There was actually nothing even in the pill. Another third of them didn't have in it what they said was in it. So I really will cause everyone to say, take a step back. Look at what you're taking. There's an amazing thing called real food, and it works. But really the message is, ask that question. Somebody tells you to take a pill. I want you to say, where is the data that it will help me? I want you to ask and say, show me a study that's well done that shows that it will benefit me. Don't say, it's my gut, it will work. Don't say, well, the body is light on it. You know, food now is grown so differently, you don't get nutrients. How many of your friends have scurvy or rickets or beriberi? I bet you it's not many. 1976, if you, your spouse, your friend thought they were pregnant, we took a tube of blood, we went to a hospital because this test could only be done at hospitals, and we injected a rabbit. 5 days later, we sacrificed the rabbit. If the rabbit's ovaries were enlarged, you were pregnant. That was the state of the art in 1976. 1977, along comes a company called Warner-Shillcutt. For $9, they had a binary test. Pregnant, not. Will rabbits of the world rejoice? And at the same time, we radically changed maternal health and neonatal health from one single test. We were able to tell a woman she was pregnant. We were able to tell a woman, your behavior needs to change, your nutrition needs to change, and we can actually start to monitor the growth of the fetus from one single test. Well, we now have the ability of looking at all the proteins in the body. We now have the ability of looking at what we call the proteome. So this is it. This is a drop of blood going through a superconducting magnet. We get a 60 gigabyte picture of all the proteins in the blood. It's a moment in time. It's the conversation happening in our body. You know, this is actually the cover of my book. And this was Steve's lasting gift to me, is that he helped design the cover. 2 weeks ago, I was in New York doing the morning show with Charlie Rose, and the guest after me was Yo-Yo Ma. And I had last seen Yo-Yo together with Mark at Steve's memorial service, and where he played beautifully. And he came up to me and said, David, you know, the cover of your book, this conversation, there's a periodicity here. The body is talking to us. I want to convert it to music. I want to make it so we can actually hear the body talking. And so I'm excited and curious to see what it will say. And hopefully we'll find that out over the next several months. But the power is we can start to look a moment in time. Remember, the way I look at genetics, it's like if you're in front of 2 Chinese restaurants and you look at the ingredient list, they're exactly the same. The food list is the same. Yet you taste the food, one can be great and one can be poor. Well, genetics are your ingredient list. What the food tastes like, that's a technology like proteomics. That's telling you a moment in time. So before I told you, ask about statins and aspirin, I don't want to say that anymore. I don't want to make generic one-size-fits-all recommendations. The way around that are technologies like this. The way around that is looking and saying, listen, at this moment, there's atherosclerosis happening. Your blood vessels are starting to get clogged. So let's make an intervention, and let's actually start to reverse it. Instead of just saying, you're 50, have a father with heart disease, take this pill. Instead of at age 50, we all go for our colonoscopy. Wouldn't it be neat if we had a blood test that say, listen, you have a colonic polyp, so let's do it, take it out. And did the doctor actually get it out? Did that polyp numbers go down? Instead of putting people through this torturous test that most people actually don't need, but works and saves many, many lives, let's start to personalize this. Let's start to actually do what matters to the individual. We have the ability to do it. When I emphasize, I just came back from the Middle East where we had a meeting on standards for personalized medicine. And you know, when the FDA was established 50 years ago, genomics, proteomics, they didn't exist. So they don't yet have the authority to regulate that area. And we need to actually set the playing field in our country. If you're a venture capitalist or someone wanting to invest money, you want to know what the risk is and the hurdle is before you put the money in. And so there hasn't been a lot of capital going into this field because we haven't set the bar. We don't know what it is. And so we need to do that. In addition, we need to do something in our field that is critical. You know, when you search on Google, your search today is better than yesterday. It looked at where people went with those same terms, and it actually makes the search better. When I see a patient today, it's the same as it was 20 years ago. That needs to change. So the notion is, well, with electronic medical records and big data, we're going to do that. The problem is we haven't established what we call data standards. So you call it a broken leg, and you call it a fractured leg. And so if we're not speaking the same language, it's very hard for big data to work. So one of the things that we need to do is start to establish that language. We need to establish that platform so we can start to take some of the remarkable things you saw on the Salesforce platform in health. Their utility is just going to go up and up and up if we can actually do that. So everyone always says, well, what's next? Well, it turns out that each of us, no offense, have tenfold more bacteria in our body than we do human cells in the body. It turns out that we have close to 20-fold more bacterial DNA than human DNA in our body. These bacteria control how we absorb our food, our metabolism, our hormone level, and many other things. If you take the bacteria from an obese human, a fat human, and put it into a skinny mouse, after several weeks, that mouse plumps up. And the inverse is also true. It was always said that the incidence of dying from breast cancer and prostate cancer in China is much less than the United States. That's true. After they move here to our country, after a decade, their risk starts to approach ours. We always said it's the Burger King and McDonald's. Turns out it's not. Turns out they adopt our bacteria, our microbiome. And this will be one of the great advances going forward, is actually starting to quantify it and qualify it in each of us and then modulate it based on our risks. And by the way, as an aside here, McDonald's is not the devil. You know, I went to Washington and we were speaking at a government meeting. They were saying, McDonald's is the devil. We got to get rid of companies that are fast food. McDonald's is a sign of the economic times, right? When the economy goes down, people go to fast food. They have no choice. McDonald's actually lowered the amount of trans fat and calories in their food over the last decade. So then people in Washington say, well, why didn't they announce it? Because if they said so, nobody would go. So they're actually heroes for pushing in that direction. And so our notion shouldn't be to say this is bad and this is good. It's to identify where there's a problem and actually start to change it and fix it. When Mayor Bloomberg in New York says, you can't get trans fats, you can't have a large soda, you know, he's right. It created tremendous discourse. There was arguing back and forth. Nanny state is good, nanny state is bad. Nobody argued trans fats were good for you. In fact, a beautiful study was published the year later showing that if you lived in New York, whether you were fat or skinny, tall or short, rich or poor, and you went shopping, your shopping was different. With discourse comes understanding. You know, George Bush was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. George Bush said you cannot have federal funding for stem cells. And it created such a debate in our country that everybody knows what a stem cell is. He was, and obviously I'm being facetious here, he was brilliant because he wanted to popularize stem cells. And what better way than to make a polarizing debate? Because of it, everybody on the street of New York City, San Francisco, LA knows what a stem cell is. It worked. We need to bring back the discourse on health. We need to make each of us start to talk and understand what we're actually doing. Health and food are 31% of our economy. We need to talk about it more. I want to tell you one thing now that's very simple. Because everyone always says, well, what are the prescriptive things we could do as an individual and change things? I'm going to tell you about something that is so simple, but has a profound effect on each of our health. The first experiment involved 1,200 kids. 600, they said to the parents, have your child go to bed whenever they want. Here's a stopwatch. Wake them up 10.5 hours later. The second group, they said, have your kids go to the bed the same time every night and wake up in 10.5 hours. Same amount of sleep exactly in both arms, yet one was regular, one was irregular. Close to a 20% increase in cognition in the kids who went to bed the same time and got up the same time. Our bodies strive for regularity. That is good to great right there. And yet we don't do it. If you have lunch today at noon and tomorrow at 2 o'clock, for 2 hours, stress hormones go up. When that happens, metabolism goes down. You actually gain weight. Your body starts to go into energy preservation mode and said, I don't know when that next meal is. I'm going to have to flee a lion. So I got to start to preserve energy. When it does that, you don't think as well. You don't exercise as well. People who graze, that is, eat their meals whenever they want, have 81% more diabetes than people who don't. So you talk about chronic medical conditions being a blight on society and hurting our economy. All we need to do is define meal times. Remember, throughout evolution, and remember, evolution doesn't select out for who lives longest. Evolution selects out for who has good children. So with evolution, sometimes you need to tweak. But evolution is that we would get up in the morning, we would have the leftovers from the night before, we would go and we would hunt, and then at night, the whole village or the family would sit down and eat their meal. We didn't have a closet that you could raid and eat whenever you want. That's an advent over the last 60 to 70 years. And that's what's actually causing major problems in our country and many others. In fact, there is an Asian country that, because of the book and talking about this, starts now to put a law that companies during meal times are going to have bells. And there's fines in companies with more than a certain number of employees who serve food during mealtime. Here in Silicon Valley, we praise companies that have food out all the time, right? The better the cafeteria, the more food available 24 hours a day, the better the company is. In actuality, it should be the opposite. You care about your employees. You're going to make sure that there's breakfast time, lunchtime, dinner. And again, it doesn't matter if you have 2 meals a day or 5. It's the regularity that counts. Your body likes to know what to expect so it can start to regulate its hormones. You know, all of us, right, we get up the same time every morning. Then on the weekends, we try to sleep a few extra hours later. When that happens, come Monday, our body expects to sleep later again. And so it takes 2 to 3 days to get off that cycle, lower those stress hormones. By the time we do, it's back to that weekend again. So again, we want to live long, better, prevent disease. A very simple thing that doesn't cost much is start to focus on these issues. You know, John Kennedy said, I'm going to put a man on the moon. And obviously this is the 50th anniversary of when John Kennedy was shot. And if you look at the New York Times the next day, the editorials were uniformly negative. The editorial said, is this where we should put our resources? It's not going to happen. Totally negative. Well, 9 years later, Neil Armstrong steps on the moon. What was the average age in Missile Command when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon? 27 years, which means those kids were 18 years old on average when Kennedy made his proclamation. So the difference in health for you and I is not going to be myself or Dr. Hellman or Dr. Chopra. What it's going to be is the next generation. And we need to start educating them about science, about medicine, about technology, about engineering. We need to make them think and get excited. We need to make them go into our domain, because one of the biggest problems we have is human capital, is that it is not sexy now for a child to start to learn about medicine or health. It is not sexy to learn about food. You know, this is the first year since World War II there's not enough food to go around in the world. So I want innovation in food. Well, who are the great food scientists today? There aren't that many. And so we need to push people. You know, I did this thing called Khan Academy that most of you here in Silicon Valley have heard about, where Sal Khan and I did a talk about various angles of health and put them up. And, you know, within a couple of weeks, 100,000+ kids see them. And the questions they ask are staggering. They get it. The problem is, if I talk about health or medicine, it crosses domains: physics, math, science, engineering. Our schooling today is one here, here, and here. We need to create a multidisciplinary education. We need to get people to understand that the way you make advances and cross those domains. I lead a center at the University of Southern California together with an engineer and a physicist. And so it's that together that gives us different approach and understanding to diseases. I thank you today for listening, and I especially thank you today for supporting Salesforce and what they do. They've supported my research over the last decade, and they've been pivotal in pushing me and helping me to make change. When you have leaders like Mark Benioff, who say the role of a company is not just to help other companies, but it's to help the community, that's a remarkable statement that we all have to take to heart. And so I thank you all for here today, for listening and for helping.
Terrific. So David, a quick question before we go on to our next speaker. So put yourself in the shoes of Art Levinson. A few weeks ago on Google+, an announcement's made, brand new company, Calico, focused on longevity. And you just gave us this whirlwind tour of a data-driven way of how you look at health. A short guide to a long life, did I get that right? So from the guy who's going to put out a book called A Short Guide to a Long Life, you're at Calico. What's the most important science question that needs to be asked and answered regarding longevity?
It's hard to put it on one question, but get a load of this, is that
I'll give you two.
Children with cancer is greater than 90% curable. Yet when that child turns 25, that same cancer becomes incurable. So there's a resiliency switch that happens, right? Disease in kids is rather rare. Disease is a function of the 6th, 7th, and 8th decade. So if we could start to figure out what changes in that system, why resiliency happens in the cancer, the heart disease, the Alzheimer's, I think we're going to get a fundamental understanding of it. And look back at these observations on this data, right? There's an observation that is profound that taking a baby aspirin reduces disease. Well, why? How does it really work? Can we optimize on that? Historically, when you take something that works and make it better, that's where you've seen the major advances.
So a resiliency switch, and why does aspirin work?
I'm with you.
Excellent. Thank you, David Agus.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much.